Good day, everyone. This is Jim Satterfield at Firestorm. We're glad to have you joining us today for our webinar. We're going to be talking about a year in review, and unfortunately, we get to do this every year to talk about what the year was and the impacts and the trends that we're starting to see, and we've got a lot to talk about in this year. So we'll go through this today, and we're going to talk, while we'll talk about things that affect governments and businesses, I also want to work in the impacts in the school market and what we're seeing in particular, the exposures that are coming there. There are several trends that are starting, and we'll go into that in detail, talking about what is the crisis risk that you and your organization could face in these areas, and we'll give examples of things that occurred this year in some of the major trend areas. And when we see the term starting to emerge around critical events and critical incident response and critical events, seem to be new terminology that's permeating the marketplace, and we'll go through those some today. So thanks for joining us, and we will continue to try to move this along today and answer these questions. So you can connect with us in a variety of ways. We're active on social media, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, or any of the other channels that we have out there. There's an opportunity for you to ask us questions. We will be monitoring the hashtag today, Crisis Coach, so that we can talk about any questions that you might have. There's a disclaimer. We have attorneys like everyone else, and so today isn't a plan, and you have to listen to the oral commentary associated with that. And now we have happy attorneys. The only thing that's more exciting than happy attorneys are happy accountants. Firestorm is a leading or the leading crisis management firm, and we're excited about what we can do with you and work through these areas. And it's appropriate with our topic today that we're talking about transforming crisis into value. What are we seeing in the trends that are there and things that must be dealt with each and every single day. Firestorm is organized around 6 different verticals: crisis and risk solutions, people solutions, security solutions, professional services, predictive intelligence, and analytic solutions. We can help show you where you are relative to standards and best practices, and we look forward to having those opportunities to talk about those things in future webinars. One statement I want to make right now is that next week, on Tuesday, we'll be doing a virtual exercise on violence. It'll be an active shooter environment, and you can put your crisis team around the table and go through what decisions you need to make at each step along in that process. It's part of a webinar series that we've been doing with OnSolve. Ann Pickering will be joining me for that particular event, and the previous 3 webinars, and you can see those recorded on our channels or on the OnSolve channels, where we talked about what do you need to do before, what do you need to do during, and what do you need to do after. So we did that webinar series this fall, and this is the culmination of it. So that is on Tuesday of next week. So if we're going to talk about crisis risk management and planning around it, why would you need to do it? What's the purpose here? And first is to increase control. When we talk about critical incidents or critical events or disasters or crises, your ability to predict and control in those processes are absolutely essential. A crisis isn't business as usual, it's business as unusual, and being able to deal with those things becomes important. Aligning with standards and best practices, we've had a series of calls this week with organizations that are thinking about how do we think about business continuity differently and looking at a program. How does that work together to put it in place? And it's not the same old check the box type of an approach. So, but aligning with standards and best practices, promoting and enforcing that culture of preparedness so that you're ready when the types of crises that we talk about today and this year in review occur, that you're set, and then the return to normal operations. But as we focus on this concept of crisis risk, I want to go back before we start to give you the specific examples and maybe give you a different way to think about this. A lot of times we see an all hazards approach start to emerge, and we get looking at that and creating a hazard impact matrix and looking at those elements to prioritize those. But I'd like you to take a step back from that, and I'm going to ask you to think about your school, your organization in light of a couple of different things. And then we're going to build that up, and then we'll go into the examples that we want to talk about today. So the first thing I'd like you to do is to think about your organization. What are your critical assets? Now, you see that we define those generally as your people. If you're a school, clearly your students and your teachers. If you're a business, your employees, your customers, your vendors, your property, your facility, your building, your information, and as we see about some of the things that have happened this year, the whole cyber and data breach area certainly is an emerging continual threat. And then finally, your brand and reputation. It is entirely possible that when we think about crises and events, that more than one of those critical assets will be impacted. So what we first have to do, if we're designing a plan, if we're thinking about how we prioritize this event relative to the others, and we'll explain a concept to help you rate a crisis compared to a different one to understand those components. And we'll go through that in today's webinar. So the first, what are your critical assets? The second thing I want you to think about is, what are the threats? Are threats a person or a thing that has the potential to harm one of those critical issues? I was traveling a lot this week, and there was an earthquake that occurred in Tennessee that was felt down in Atlanta. That's normally not a threat that we're thinking about in Atlanta, but if you're in California, you certainly could think that way. We've thought about the wildfires and the hurricanes that have occurred, or the case of violence, the threats that are there. So first, what are your critical assets? What's the threats that you could be exposed to? The third thing I want you to do is to look at, what are your vulnerabilities? Where is there a gap? Where is there an opportunity that threat could exploit a vulnerability, causing an event to come into your organization? Looking at what those weaknesses and gaps are and the ability to recognize and respond. We've got a series of things that we're doing with our people division and our predictive analytics with Cheyenne Marlin, and the surveys that we've done to help organizations start to benchmark in those particular areas. And we're working with organizations around that right now. So what are your critical assets? What are your threats? What are your vulnerabilities? And that all comes together to go to the word risk. And this is much more of an insurance-related aspect. And you think about insurance as a risk transfer, or it's an opportunity to how do we recover in those particular areas. But it's really the overlap of your assets, your threats, and your vulnerabilities, that red portion in the drawing over to the side, that lets you know what we're talking about. So it's the potential loss or damage to a critical asset caused by a vulnerability being exploited by a threat. If you take this approach, this is a good way, as we talk about many times, getting senior management buy-in into a process, letting them believe in what we're talking about, and now you're talking more strategically within your organization. Now, if this actually comes together, then we could have an event. And we want to think about that, and that's preceded by triggers. And as we're designing all these things, what are the triggers that let us know this is about to occur, that there's a potential event that's highly likely, or in fact that it's occurred? In terms of behavior in our schools, we talk about warning signs and behaviors of concern. Also key anniversaries. I was dealing with a school district, and they're concerned about some critical anniversaries that are coming up of prior events and what that might mean associated with it. So the trigger comes, and then the event happens, and so that when that's at the point that the risk becomes a reality, and there's an actual loss or damage of one of those critical assets that were up there. Now, if we're not prepared, then that event is going to have the potential to escalate into a crisis. And if you look at it, and with all those little figures running hither, thither, and yon on the right on the slide, you can see it's going to impact your stakeholders, and understanding who those stakeholders are in advance becomes critical. Your brand, your reputation, trust, and or your strategic goals, or all of those things together. So I think that's one reason why annually this webinar series that we're doing today starts to get more awareness, because what actually occurred this year that tells us where the world is going and what do we need to consider around it. Now, I promised you before I gave you the events that we've called out this year to give you a system that you can then look at, and how do you compare this crisis to another crisis. And this is a project that we've now been working on with several large corporations and the insurance market. They came to us and said, how do you compare the shootings in Las Vegas to the wildfires in California, to the hashtag #MeToo movement, the hurricanes or whatever occurs? How do we track that and see what's going forward in each of those areas? So this will give you that insight. First, when we look at that crisis risk level, we want to see what the triggers are associated with it. And we divided that into three emotional lenses that we look at to see how people are responding. Is there outrage? Is there fault? And is there fear? Are people outraged that this event had occurred? And the level of that, what level does it rise to? Is there fault? Did we do something wrong? And so the discussion is not only about the outrage, it's about the fault and the things that we did wrong or allowed it to occur. And finally, is there fear? Is there something else that would happen? We used the example of the Flint, Michigan water problem from several years ago. Was there outrage? Yes. A parent goes to the sink and turns open the tap, and suddenly the glass is filled with brown water. Smells bad. It tastes bad. Outrage over this. I'm paying for this. And then is there fault? Yes. Turns out people knew about it in a variety of different government agencies and involvements and leadership, and charges have ultimately come from that. Is there fear? Yes, my child could get cancer as a result of this. So measure this first through the emotional lens. So whatever's occurring around you, whatever you feel the major crises are, stop first in saying, is there outrage? What's the cause of that? Is there fault? And is there fear? By the way, I'll share with you that almost everything you learn initially in a crisis is wrong. So your people may say, well, we're not at fault here, and later turns out, in fact, that you are. So if that gives us the crisis risk level, then what's the scope of it as we're focused in on it? And we look at scope by measuring what's the reach, what's the acceleration, and what's the context associated with it. Does this affect one of our people? Does it affect 10 customers, 100 customers, thousands of customers? We're going to see some staggering numbers when we look at the events of this year that were measured in the hundreds of millions of people. So the reach becomes an important element. The acceleration, are you the lead story on CNN? Are you in the lead story in the penny saver associated with it? And then finally, what's the context? What are we talking about in this area? Is this hashtag #MeToo, as we've seen the impact that it's had on our culture across the country? So if we think about these two elements, looking at the outrage, fault, and free as a vertical axis, and think about a horizontal axis being reach, acceleration, and context, now we have a grid that we can map that crisis out. And it will lead us to a conclusion on the crisis. Is it at a guarded level? Is it at a elevated level? Is it at a severe level? So in looking at those things, those are aspects that we're going to be able to determine, and more importantly, you can, when that event occurs in your school or your organization or your business, you're trying to say, well, what is the crisis risk level associated with this particular event? Now, when I talked about mapping that together, and we use the phrase, what seems off, think about outreach, fault, and fear. If you, along the vertical axis, you would rate the outrage or fault or fear from no or little all the way up to extreme. And across the horizontal, we're measuring the reach, acceleration, and context from no or little all the way to severe. Then you can see it gives us some guides in terms of how we need to move through us, looking at the decisions, actions, and words that we need to generate associated with it. So if it's down in that lower quadrant, we're going to be monitoring developments. We're not going to be actively involved. It's not yet at a level that would cause us to have that concern. If it's in the middle area where it's elevated, we're going to be managing our response. How do we respond to that particular event, the fire or the tornado or the shooting event? And then finally, if it's at a severe level, we're going to be mitigating the impacts, and that'll be our attention. So these become management tools. It's a great way to get your senior leadership involved in what's going on associated with it. And we'll talk about each of these in the year in review in just a second. So remember, everything you learn initially in that crisis is wrong. So your leadership and yourself will find you having to make decisions based upon wrong or incomplete information. That's why the crisis risk level and rating becomes so important. But the consequences are going to last for years. We talk a great deal about how crisis defines an organization. And we do this in an open audience a lot and talk about doing a comparison. And you think about the state flower. I'm here in Georgia, and our state flower is the Cherokee Rose. And as you go around, you ask people what their state flowers are, and then we pick an arbitrary state. Colorado. What's the state flower in Colorado? And the answer is columbine. But when you hear the name columbine, you don't stop and think about that's the state flower. We think about the shootings that occurred there, because crisis defines, and that's what we're going to talk about today with these events. So the worst disaster you will see is one that happens to you or your school or your people. As you think of each one of these things, that's what we're going to go through and do it. Now, we had a long discussion internally, and we started to put it into groups. And when we think about the 2018, the crises that we were most concerned about fell into these 6 categories: violence, #MeToo, environmental, cyber breach, financial, and civility. Those are the crises that made our list this year. We're going to start with violence, and I think that's going to become clearer as we go through and look at those. We certainly didn't pull every violence event, because if we did, that would be all we talk about today. Just reading the list would take up more than the time allotted here. But I wanted to bring up a few with specific examples to remind you. It started off in January with a shooting in Pennsylvania at Mel's Car Wash. I want to point this one out because think about it. Here's a small business in a small market, and it started the year off with us thinking about people being shot. What's simpler than going to get your car washed associated with it? It escalated the following month with the shootings at Parkland at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School shooting. 17 people were killed. 17 were injured. It happened on Valentine's Day. The symbolism of that is overwhelming. And when you look at the lessons learned out of that particular event, we had a person that was on a path to violence, had been on a path to violence, and it was commonly known in a wide area. And so one of the lessons learned from here is that there are warning signs, and you have to have a program to deal with these events, and it continues to escalate. I'm going to come back and talk about schools yet again before we get off of the violence area. In May, we had another shooting in Santa Fe, Texas. 10 killed, 10 injured. Again, think about the feelings that it would be like to be in a school where you have to pick up the phone and call a family and say, your child is not coming home from school today. No one wants to make that call. No one wants to receive that call, and no one will ever forget it. So as we think about this, it's more than numbers and more than details, but looking at it, and we want to make a difference in this area. And I'll tell you a statistic as we finish this section up. In June, we had another business event. It happened in Annapolis, Maryland, at the Capital Gazette publishing company, a newspaper there locally. 5 were killed, 2 were injured. And again, it was identified with warning signs and behaviors that could have been an intervention. But Annapolis, Maryland, we lived in Baltimore for a number of years, and you think about Annapolis as a safe place. You don't think about those types of events. Back to Pennsylvania again in October with the Tree of Life synagogue shooting. 11 killed, 6 injured. We see our churches, mosques, and synagogues becoming regular points of violence for us to consider and look and to see those impacts as they're coming. And I think they're certainly an overwhelming issue for all of us. And then the last one that's from 2018 that we wanted to mention were the shootings in Thousand Oaks, California, the Borderline Bar and Grill shooting. 12 killed, 11 injured. These are not large businesses. It's not the venue. It's shooting at Las Vegas where 400 were shot in a previous year concert. Those are things that are just staggering. But thinking about you could go to dinner tonight and end up being a target of that. So violence has become a key issue across America. Here's the statistic that I wanted to tell you that I think would make a difference, particularly for all of our schools that are listening to this portion of our discussion today. 2018 represents a 60% increase in gun violence in schools over the highest previous year. By the way, the highest previous year was 2006. So think of the fact that it's the number for 2018, if nothing else happens between now and the end of the year, is already 60% higher than the previous high year. The previous high year was 54. This year, I think we're already at 94 school shootings. That's a staggering statistic. What that tells us is what we're doing today is not working. Whether it's putting in a program around behavioral risk threat assessment or looking at predictive, protective intelligence, we're seeing a real push to make a difference in these areas. And violence is also changing the insurance marketplace. Today, there are new insurance policies that are available related to deadly weapons and active shooter, and it makes a difference to have those assessments done at the time the policy goes into effect and having the risk management services during the policy and then being able to respond in that very critical first hour. Now, if we move beyond those types of violence, there's violence in other formats, and clearly it was certainly brought to the attention of the country in September with the hearings for Judge Kavanaugh and the allegations of what he had done in college or in high school at an earlier time. And the hashtag #MeToo movement is really centered into a variety of aspects associated with our lives. But I think it became a major element, and we saw it going back and even affecting us in the school marketplace. There was a teacher at a school that was the home where the activities that were spoken of occurring, and that person had let it out that their name and their school it was associated with. So someone, not in Washington, D.C., someone not directly in that area, was impacted about the elements associated with it. This is also changing our interactions in the schools and in our business workplaces. If you look at the picture there of Bill Cosby and the whole allegations around it, and just with the holiday season that we're in now, an industry standard that was out of "Baby, It's Cold Outside," and this was a discrimination song, a sexual molestation song, and as opposed to a happy, positive feeling, it changes what we can say and what we can do and what we can think today. So I think it's a different lens by which we are viewed in our workplace today, and actions that occurred years ago come back and are recast in the light of that. So if we think about violence and we think about hashtag #MeToo, those are our major categories of things that we're seeing And that's going to continue on into 2019. Now, when we also think about this year, we could have listed page after page of events that caused significant damages. You had Hurricane Florence and Hurricane Michael, and the flooding that came after Michael that came back as that water that was accumulated came down the rivers into the communities, and we had devastating flooding. When you look at, that was Florence, and then Michael, if you look at the Panhandle and the scenes of devastation there, where homes and entire structures were just washed away, the impact there will be felt for years to come. And early estimates were 18 and 14 billion. I anticipate that 14 billion number for Michael will more than double associated with it. We would be remiss if we didn't talk about the California wildfires. We were plagued with a long season there, and the devastation in Paradise and the Camp Fire. Whatever your vision or thought of, or what comes to your mind when you see the pictures in California, it looks like hell. Everything is gone. Everything is destroyed. The numbers of structures are in the tens and tens of thousands that are lost. The number of lives lost and people still missing. The impact are just overwhelming. We are very blessed in our country that we have police that run toward the gunfire, that we have firemen that run toward the fire to help in the areas. But crisis defines each one of these events and others defined specifically. And we know that in 2019, we're going to have more environmental events. So anticipate that this is going to continue to be a significant factor as we look ahead. It certainly was as we look back. And when you add up the total financial impact of these events, look for the impact coming back to us in the insurance marketplace with increased premiums. Cyber breach. Just when you think it can't get worse, it does. And the number of reports continue to escalate. And just in the last week, we see the story about Marriott. Marriott had passport information taken, identities, and over 500 million people were subjected to this particular breach. And when we think about it, I think there's been an underreaction in many cases on cyber because it's more common. Again, there are insurance policies that will help and protect from that, but it's the process of what you need to put into place. And there are always allegations that this could have been prevented or it could have been mitigated, and fault comes in. I was reading a story just as I was starting to go online with today's webinar, that there's now an app. If you feel that you have been a cyber breach, the app allows you to file suit directly by completing the app. I would say that based upon that creativity, let's go ahead and start to expect that we're going to have an active shooter app shortly to file those suits associated with it. This is a change in the market, and the allocations here are that you should have known and you could have intervened and you could have made a difference. The other element here is the things that you've probably been seeing in the news this week, that China was behind this, that this was a threat here, and it starts to come in and impact us in ways in our next category. But cyber breach is a criminal act, and it is one of the few criminal acts that can happen, and if you're the victim of, you can still have liability. That's an amazing factor to consider of what we're looking for. And we've become so accustomed to it, we don't seem to have the outrage as much associated with it. But that word fault, where we talked about outrage, fault, and fear, are clearly there. And in this situation, the fear is at a very high level associated with it. But in coming back and thinking about each of these things, we added economies. First year, as we've done our review, that we put the word economy up as a crisis in one of those significant defining events. And I see that a former Fed chair is indicating that we'll be moving toward a recession. Now, unemployment is at a very low rate, historic in many respects, that more people are working and there are less people that are looking, but that's also creating a tension in terms of there are jobs that are going unfilled because people don't want to take the jobs. There's an economic pressure on wages associated with it. Now, there have been tariff thoughts. What are we going to impose certain tariffs on various countries, and whether it's dealing with the Saudi and gas associated with it, or dealing with China and tariffs there about the relationships and the imports and exports, and then just the Marriott data breach ahead of time. So the uncertainty in the market, and given the size of it, we're seeing massive swings on a regular basis. And those impacts affect the ability to retire, your pension, your 401k, your ability to find a job, your ability to keep a job. So look for the economy to, as we focus into next year, and think about it just as it was a factor this year. And we're seeing in our own business a significant change. We're doing, in our people division, more alternative workforce or staff augmentation, because we can supply people where organizations are reluctant to make a permanent commitment to a hire in filling in those areas. So I think, and you've heard terms in the past like the gig economy. This area will be a growing concern. And again, I would like you to think about it. What does it mean in our area? If you're a school, does that mean, can we find the teachers that we need? If you're running a child care center, can you afford to pay the workers in the child care center? So the economic pressures are certainly a factor that are now starting to be that looming cloud on the horizon. The last category is civility. And I didn't have a particular story that I wanted to emphasize over the others, because I think depending upon your point of view on any story, it might be pouring gasoline on your fire around that and talking about it. But we've reached a point now where it's almost like a boxing match. We all go to a neutral corner, a bell is rung, and we come out and meet in the center of the ring. And we can't talk about issues, and we can't talk about things in the ways that we have in prior years, because we have a point to make, we're not listening, and we don't speak with each other, we speak at each other. And that escalation really is a beginning of a behavior of concern or a warning sign, going back to the first section that we talked about, and that's violence. I would encourage you to think about your organization as you look at the coming school year, the business side of the house. For 2019, are there things that you need to put in place to deal with this issue? #MeToo has caused us to swing very far in the pendulum and right some wrongs that have clearly been there, but yet still to create a feeling of uncertainty, of talking to an individual and what we're looking for in each of these areas. So we had 6 categories. When we think about it, violence is now a major concern in each of your areas. If your responsibility is business continuity within your organization, having to think about that not as just a security job, but as one that affects your operation and your ability to respond becomes absolutely critical. Clearly in our schools, keeping our children safe is an issue. Are we arming teachers? And if we do so, what's our plan? How do we handle that? And what role does that need to play? #MeToo suddenly has changed how we interact in any type of a work environment associated with it. It becomes an element for us to be concerned about. We know environmental issues are going to happen. We shouldn't come as a surprise that the wildfires occur, that the floods, the hurricanes come, and we watch in those particular areas. And one of the things that we have said in the beginning from Firestorm is that our largest single competitor is to disaster denial. It's not going to happen here. It's going to happen to somebody else, and if it does happen here, it won't be so bad. and we're smarter than anyone else. There were a lot of people that are smarter than anyone else that lost their home in California, that lost their home in Florida, that experienced flooding. So these things happen where we are. Where we have concentrations of people, we have concentrations of exposure, and that means that our resources will be taxed as we try to respond to those areas. I think we're starting to see now the seeds in 2018 that'll start to manifest themselves in 19 and 20 around our economy and our financial side of the house. Look for that pressure to continue to escalate. And cyber breach is a way of life now. What do you have a cyber breach response plan? Not dealing with the forensic side, and because there are great people out there that offer great services, but how do you know that it's occurring? What is your response? What are you going to say? What are you not going to say? How do we deal with these issues? Because it's not a big business only problem. It's not a problem for a government entity or a large hospitality industry like Marriott brings to the table. We're seeing small law firms being attacked. We're seeing schools particularly being attacked under cyber. But it ultimately comes back that we're all in this together, and this concept of civility becomes one that I would encourage you to think about in creating not only that culture of preparedness within your organization, but a culture of how we're in this together and what we're going to do. So as we started our broadcast and talked a little bit about what we're doing. We would love to help you in any way, whether it's our predictive intelligence or how you identify warning signs or what you do if these various things occur or the staffing that you need to handle it, or we're concerned about security in our particular organization. We're here and we want to help. There are some immediate opportunities for you to take advantage of. You can download, there'll be a brief up probably next week around our webinar today, and you can do that. You also can go there and view prior recordings of webinars that have been done or share them with others in your staff. If you find yourself concerned about where you are, we'll do a no-fee self-assessment with you. We'll sit down and help you understand where your organization is relative to standards and best practices. And we have a crisis stop program where we will guarantee our response in that critical first hour in a crisis. So please talk with us if we can help in that aspect. I mentioned at the very beginning today about next week, and on the 18th, we're going to do a virtual exercise focused around violence. I would encourage you to register for that, put your crisis team around the table, not only involving people that are involved in your operational side, but security and business continuity, as you think about all of those elements to be able to deal with it. If you haven't, Firestorm has a digital newsletter. It goes out every Thursday, and it talks about these types of events. There's generally an article or two about subject matters that would be of interest to you, and a way to link to these types of resources, and the newsletter is free. So in this day and age, if you don't have to write a check, that's a very good thing. Also, it will give you the top jobs that are available. We have, through our Cheyenne and BC management, we give a listing of those jobs, and that gives you an opportunity to continue to advance your career in a variety of directions. We're coming to a very special time of the year. The holiday season reminds us all to think about what our role is and what we want to be able to give back and to do for each other. It's a time of joy and happiness. It's a time of opportunity and seeing a vision for a new year that's coming forward. We'll continue this webinar series in 2019 and talk about those things, and have laid out an aggressive editorial calendar with these events to have you have that opportunity. We hope you don't find yourself in a crisis. If you do, please pick up the phone and give us a call. We're responding to about 6 crises a day somewhere across America. Some of those are large, some of those are small, but if they're happening to you, that's the worst disaster you'll ever see. So thank you for what you do for your school, for your organization, for your company. We appreciate your time and your leadership and what you've done. Hopefully today we gave you a little different way to think about the plans that you need and thinking about your assets, the threats, the vulnerabilities, thinking about what are the triggers that are going to activate those plans, and then how you compare this crisis to another by looking at the outrage, the fault, and the fear, and then finally, what's the reach, acceleration, and context. We always want you to be able to focus on what are the decisions you need to make, what are the actions that you need to take, and what are the words that you need to say. So there's a lot happening. A lot happened this year. It was very major to all of those people that we saw referenced. Thank you again. Happy New Year. Happy holidays. I look forward to speaking with you again. Good day.